Karen Mallory hated the dog the moment she saw it, big and muscular. It wasn't aggressive, but to Karen, it was a threat because of who held the leash. A confident black man who walked through the neighborhood like he belonged there. She tried the usual tactics, sideways comments about leash laws and warnings about children playing nearby. But Andre Whitaker didn't rattle, and that infuriated her more than anything else. Then, one morning, something changed. A single treat appeared near the edge of her lawn. Just a small, innocent-looking piece of food left where the dog might find it. Andre saw it too late, and within minutes, everything changed. Karen thought no one would know it was her, that her crimes would never catch up to her. But what she didn't know was who she had just provoked. Andre Whitaker wasn't just her new neighbor. He was the Attorney General. And while she thought this would end in silence, it's only just begun, because this time the law is watching, and it's coming for her. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from, and make sure to subscribe. The late afternoon sun poured like warm honey over the manicured lawns of Meadow Glen, the kind of neighborhood where silence wasn't merely a product of peace, but expectation, where homeowners' associations wielded more control than town officials, and conformity wasn't requested so much as quietly enforced. The homes stood in identical rows of colonial ambition, each one a glossy postcard of domestic perfection, trimmed hedges in symmetrical obedience, driveways polished to near mirror gleam, and American flags hanging just so from every other porch. On the surface, it was picturesque, even enviable, but beneath the charm, something colder stirred. An unspoken code, one that dictated who truly belonged and who, despite the price of their mortgage, would always remain an intruder. Andre Whitaker didn't miss the way curtains stirred when he passed. He noticed the brief flickers of faces peering through blinds before vanishing into shadows, as if the act of watching him was a shameful thing even they couldn't quite justify. He didn't need to be told he was being observed. The stares were as palpable as humidity, clinging to his skin, even as he walked with the same ease and grace that had defined his presence in courtrooms and press briefings for years. It didn't matter that he wore a tailored tracksuit or that his Rottweiler Duke stayed perfectly at heel. To some of these people, the image of a tall, well-built black man moving confidently through their neighborhood, dog leash in hand, was enough to stir every fear they'd learned to dress up as concern. The leash was unnecessary, if Andre was being honest. Duke, with his gleaming black coat and intelligent amber eyes, obeyed with the kind of precision that came only from training layered with mutual respect. There was no tension in the leash. It hung loose between them, swaying gently as they moved past flowering shrubs and automatic sprinklers, humming beneath perfect grass. Duke's ears flicked toward the sound of birds, but his stride never changed. His focus never shifted. He walked beside Andre as if he understood the importance of posture in this place, where perception meant everything. As they turned the corner onto Wexley Drive, the energy shifted, not dramatically, but with the subtlety of a chill in still air. A figure stood on her porch across the street, arms crossed, one foot planted slightly ahead of the other like she was preparing for confrontation that hadn't yet begun. Karen Mallory, mid-50s, silver blonde hair pulled into a tight knot, and the permanent scowl of someone who considered themselves the final line of defense for the neighborhood's standards. She didn't smile. She never had. Not since the day Andre moved in and introduced himself with a polite handshake she didn't take. She watched them again now, eyes locked on Duke, her jaw clenched just tightly enough to be visible. Andre felt it in his chest, that now familiar flare of irritation, but he kept his face calm, unreadable. He wasn't new to this dance. He had dealt with senators who had mastered the art of smiling while sharpening knives beneath the table. Karen was no different, just smaller, just louder. "Afternoon," he said coolly, nodding without slowing his stride. Karen didn't return the greeting. Instead, her eyes dropped to Duke. "Is that dog leashed?" she asked, her voice carrying in the kind of crisp tone that didn't expect an answer so much as compliance. Andre stopped, slow and deliberate. Duke sat at his side without being told, his head tilted, as if he too was trying to interpret the hostility being aimed his way. "He's leashed," Andre replied evenly, holding up the loop still relaxed in his hand. "And licensed. And vaccinated. Would you like to see his paperwork?" Karen's eyes narrowed, the faint twitch at the corner of her mouth betraying her frustration that he wasn't reacting the way she wanted, wasn't flinching, wasn't getting angry, wasn't giving her the scene she was clearly itching to ignite. "That dog looks dangerous," she said, shifting her weight, as if that changed the weight of her words. "You know this is a family neighborhood." Andre almost laughed, but the smile that curled his lips didn't reach his eyes. "And I'm walking my dog, in silence, on a leash. Tell me, what exactly about that threatens your idea of family?" Karen bristled. "You don't need to be snide. I'm just saying, people around here are concerned. You may not realize it, but Rottweilers have a reputation. I've read stories. They snap. Just like that." Andre looked down at Duke, who blinked slowly, utterly unbothered. "You read stories," he echoed softly, more to himself than to her. "You know, some people read stories about black men walking through neighborhoods they just moved into. Doesn't make them true." Her lips parted, startled by the directness, but no words came. He nodded again, slower this time. "Have a good day, Mrs. Mallory." And with that, he continued walking. Duke beside him, the leash still loose, his back still straight. He didn't look over his shoulder, didn't glance back to see if she was still standing there. He didn't need to. He felt it, the seething indignation clinging to her like perfume, sharp and synthetic, reeking of superiority wounded by its own impotence. As he rounded the next corner and disappeared from her sight, he exhaled through his nose. The air felt heavier now, tinged with something ugly. He knew that look she gave him hadn't been a warning. It had been a promise, the kind that never arrives as thunder but creeps like static before the storm. And though he didn't know how or when it would come, Andre Whitaker had seen enough of the world to know that the storm always comes, quiet, vengeful, and just desperate enough to make the foolish think they'll get away with it. Andre didn't mention the incident that night over dinner, not out of forgetfulness or hesitation, but because the weight of it hadn't fully settled into his bones yet. There was a part of him, conditioned through years in courtrooms and backdoor meetings, that wanted to believe it would end there, that Karen Mallory had simply indulged in one of her little performances and would now retreat back into her fortress of curtain-twitching judgment. But as the steak seared gently on the cast-iron pan and the soft rhythm of jazz played low from the speakers in the corner, he felt it lingering in the back of his mind like a cold draft through a closed window, subtle, persistent, and unwelcome. Sharon noticed, of course. She always did. The moment he set the plate in front of her and sat across the dining table with a silence a little too long, a little too measured, she looked up from her glass of wine and studied his face with the quiet precision of someone who had spent a lifetime reading his silences more fluently than his words. "So," she said lightly, lifting her fork, "are you going to tell me what she said today? Or am I supposed to guess which shade of ridiculous she decided to try this time?" Andre let out a breath that sounded too much like a laugh to be one and too bitter to be amusement. "She's worried Duke is a threat to the neighborhood," he said, carving into his food without looking up. "Apparently, he looks dangerous. Might snap. You know, one of those family neighborhood concerns." Sharon chewed slowly, eyes narrowing slightly. "Did she say that before or after you reminded her who you are?" "I didn't," Andre replied, finally meeting her gaze. "Not yet." She leaned back, her posture fluid, thoughtful. "You're giving her the benefit of the doubt." "I'm giving her room to hang herself with her own rope," he said simply. "If I say who I am now, it becomes a conversation about intimidation, about status. You know the script. I want her to write it herself before I take the pen away." A faint smile tugged at Sharon's lips, though it didn't reach her eyes. Just make sure she doesn't write it in blood first. The next morning, Andre found a pair of pamphlets tucked neatly into his mailbox, sealed in a plastic sleeve, as if someone had taken special care to protect their contents from the morning dew. He recognized them before he even unfolded them. One was from a local animal control office, outlining leash laws and neighborhood expectations for aggressive breeds. The other was a printout of a blog post titled, "Why Rottweilers Might Be More Dangerous Than You Think." There was no note, no signature, not even a highlighted section to indicate the intention. But none of that was necessary. The message was clear enough. Someone, Karen, had taken the time to gather information she believed would justify her discomfort and disguise it as civic duty. Andre stood there for a long moment, the morning sun casting long shadows over his front steps. He didn't feel anger exactly, not yet, but there was a tightening in his chest, a slow turning of gears that signaled this was no longer a matter of chance or misunderstanding. She was escalating, and she wanted him to know she was escalating. Rather than toss the pamphlets, he took a photograph of them laid out on the kitchen counter, and then slid them into a folder in his office labeled simply, Karen M. Beneath it were already a few printed screenshots from his security cameras, and notes he had begun scribbling down each evening. Dates, times, observations, nothing dramatic, just pieces of a puzzle she didn't know he was assembling. That afternoon, he walked Duke again. Not out of habit, but principle. Karen was back on her porch, garden shears in hand, snipping at a hedge that barely needed trimming. She didn't look up at first, but as Andre approached, she paused and glanced over. Eyes cold, mouth thin. She said nothing. Andre slowed, stopped at the edge of her yard, and gave her the smile he reserved for people who thought themselves too clever to be caught. "I got your reading material," he said, voice calm. "Very informative." She turned, feigning confusion. "I'm sorry?" "The pamphlets," he said, holding up his phone to show her the photo. "Nice touch. Appreciate the concern." Karen blinked, the smile she offered paper-thin and brittle. "Oh, well, I just thought it might be helpful. Some people don't realize how dangerous those dogs can be, especially with children around." Andre nodded slowly, letting her sit in her own words for a beat too long before replying. "And some people don't realize how dangerous it is to dress prejudice up as public safety." Her lips parted, just slightly. "Excuse me?" "No," he said, stepping closer, still calm, still level. "You don't get to hide behind politeness, Mrs. Mallory. You don't get to leave anonymous warnings in mailboxes and pretend you're just being neighborly. If you have a problem with me or my dog, say it plainly." Karen's jaw tensed. "I don't have a problem. I have concerns." "Well, let me put your concerns to rest," Andre said, his tone cooling further. "Duke is a certified, retired service dog. He's never bitten a soul. He's licensed, leashed, and trained, which is more than I can say for some people." She flinched, but he didn't wait for her rebuttal. He turned and continued down the sidewalk, Duke at his side, the leash slack between them like a quiet defiance. Behind him, he could feel her watching, eyes burning into the back of his skull, the seeds of something uglier already beginning to sprout. And as the dog walked beside him, alert but unbothered, Andre made a mental note, not of what she'd said, but of what she hadn't. The silent message in her clenched fists and pursed mouth. She wasn't finished, and neither was he. The next confrontation didn't begin with words. It began with silence, the heavy, expectant kind that settles over a street before something unnatural breaks the routine. Andre had begun to notice how the neighborhood shifted its rhythm when he and Duke appeared. Sprinklers that once sputtered faithfully on their morning schedules now held their breath until he passed. Lawn chairs were occupied one moment and vacated the next. Even the mail carrier seemed to speed up when they approached. It was subtle, but patterns always betrayed themselves in time, and Andre, having built his career unraveling stories no one wanted told, was not the kind of man to ignore such patterns. It was on the third consecutive morning that the change occurred. He had chosen a slightly different route for Duke's walk, not out of fear or discomfort, but because he didn't want to give Karen the satisfaction of routine. Predictability gave petty people leverage, and he had no intention of becoming predictable. The morning air was cool, the sun just beginning to rise above the rooftops, casting gold across the sidewalks. Duke trotted ahead with quiet focus, his tail wagging lazily, nose occasionally sniffing at the grass, but never straying far from Andre's stride. And then he saw it. Subtle, seemingly innocuous, lying at the very edge of Karen's lawn, where the boundary between sidewalk and property blurred. A small dog treat, half buried in the grass, oddly out of place. Andre slowed, brow furrowing. It wasn't unusual for dogs to drop treats or toys during walks, but something about this one felt deliberate. It was too neatly placed, too clean, as though it hadn't been dropped by accident, but set there with care. Before he could react, Duke's head dipped. Andre's hand tensed around the leash, but it was already too late. Duke had sniffed it once, then taken it gently into his mouth and swallowed. Andre swore under his breath, moving to pull him away, but the treat was gone. The dog licked his lips and looked up, tail thumping once. It was in that moment that Karen emerged, as though cued by some silent signal, stepping out onto her porch with a mug in her hand and a smile so artificial it should have come with packaging. She was in a robe this time, hair pinned up, trying to look casual, unbothered. But Andre saw the glint in her eyes. Not satisfaction, not yet, but anticipation. She wanted something to happen. Something she could narrate later to the neighborhood forum or the HOA board, painting herself as the watchful neighbor standing guard against perceived danger. "Morning," she called, tone chipper enough to curdle milk. Andre didn't answer. His eyes drifted from her to the patch of grass where the treat had been, then back to her again. She followed his gaze and offered a shrug that was far too casual. "Something wrong?" she asked, taking a sip from her mug. "Did you leave anything out here?" he asked, voice flat, almost conversational. Karen tilted her head, feigning innocence. "Out here? No. Why?" Duke suddenly wobbled. It was slight, barely more than a hesitation in his gait. But Andre felt it immediately. The leash tightened in his hand as he knelt, eyes narrowing. Duke stood still for a moment, then blinked slowly, his head dipping low as though suddenly drowsy. Hey, boy," Andre murmured, placing a hand on Duke's side. The dog looked at him, but his eyelids were heavier now, breath shallower. Another second passed, then he staggered again. Andre's chest tightened as panic crawled up his spine. He looked at the patch of grass again. "What the hell was in that?" he snapped, standing and fixing his gaze on Karen. She stepped back slightly, startled, her mask of composure slipping. "Excuse me? There was something on your lawn. My dog ate it. Now he's acting like he's about to drop. What the hell was in it?" Karen held up both hands, her voice climbing in pitch. "I didn't leave anything out." "I don't know what you're talking about." Andre knelt again beside Duke, who was now panting, lying down fully, eyes fluttering. His limbs twitched slightly, not in pain, but as though his muscles were forgetting what to do. "You need to tell me what was in that treat," Andre said, this time with a sharpness that cut through the morning stillness like a blade. "I didn't put anything there," Karen said again, but this time her voice had a different edge to it. Less indignant, more defensive. Andre didn't respond. He was already lifting Duke's massive frame, gritting his teeth against the weight, ignoring the pain in his shoulders. The leash dangled loosely from his wrist as he carried the dog back down the sidewalk, every step fueled not by strength, but by fury, tempered into something colder, more focused. Karen called something after him, but he didn't turn. He didn't need to see her face to know that beneath the denial, beneath the fear of exposure, there was something else. Something far more dangerous. She hadn't expected this. Not the collapse. Not the evidence. Not the reality that she may have just crossed a line she couldn't explain away. As he reached his driveway, He yanked open the car door and lowered Duke into the back seat, his hand trembling slightly as he pressed the ignition. He didn't fumble. He didn't panic. He reached for his phone with one hand, and with the other, he slid the folder labeled Karen M. from his passenger seat onto the floor. It was no longer just a collection of notes. It was a case file now. He looked once more at Duke, whose eyes met his with faint recognition, then flickered closed again. Andre turned to the camera mounted above his garage, its little green light blinking steadily. It had seen everything, and now, so would the rest of the world. The road blurred beneath the tires, each turn taken faster than the one before, yet Andre's hands never lost their grip. One stayed firm on the wheel, the other rested gently across Duke's massive chest. Fingers splayed as if by sheer will alone, he could anchor life into that slowing, shallow rhythm. The dog's breaths were growing fainter with each mile, his thick ribcage rising in stuttering intervals. No longer steady, no longer strong. His head rested limp against the folded towel Andre had hurriedly placed beneath it, tongue slightly protruding from the side of his mouth, eyes half-lidded, heavy with something that felt too much like surrender. "Stay with me, Duke," Andre muttered, voice low but trembling with urgency. "You hear me? Just hang on. We're almost there." The vet's office wasn't far, but every stoplight felt like an insult, every delay a deliberate sabotage. Andre ran the last one, ignoring the horn that followed, his focus narrowed to the dying weight beside him. He hadn't let himself feel it yet. Not fear, not anger, not grief, just urgency, cold, desperate precision. But somewhere deep in his chest, a crack had already formed, spidering slowly, the pressure building behind it with every gasp Duke failed to take. As the clinic came into view, he didn't bother with a parking space. He pulled up directly in front of the emergency entrance and leapt out, opening the back door and hoisting Duke into his arms with a strength that felt less like muscle and more like refusal. Refusal to believe this was the end. Refusal to let a walk in the morning sun become a eulogy by nightfall. The door slammed behind him, and the startled receptionist barely had time to look up before he was inside. Voice ringing across the sterile tile. "I need a vet. Now. He's been poisoned." Before she could even call back, a pair of double doors burst open, and Dr. Soraya Hale emerged in a white coat, her expression instantly shifting from confusion to grim understanding. Her almond eyes dropped to Duke's limp form, then back to Andre, who stood rigid, breath heaving, refusing to sit, refusing to give in. "Bring him this way," she said, already turning on her heel. The moment Duke was placed on the table, a swarm of movement followed. Assistants rushed in, one drawing blood, another shaving a patch of fur for the IV. Soraya moved like a conductor amid a symphony of urgency, barking orders with calm clarity. Her hands steady as she listened to the shallow heartbeat beneath her stethoscope. "What was it?" she asked over her shoulder. "I don't know," Andre replied, voice thick. "A treat on the edge of a lawn. He ate it before I could stop him." "Any vomiting? Seizures?" "No. Just got drowsy. Then collapsed." Soraya nodded without looking up, adjusting the IV drip. "We'll flush his system, but if it was fast-acting, she didn't finish. She didn't need to." Andre stepped closer, brushing a hand along Duke's massive shoulder. The dog's eyes opened slightly, cloudy but still aware. The gaze that met Andre's wasn't panicked. It was trusting, tired. A quiet acknowledgement that something was wrong but that he wasn't alone. A soft whimper escaped Duke's throat, barely audible, but it cut deeper than any scream could have. "I'm right here, buddy," Andre whispered, leaning in close. "You're not going anywhere. Not like this. Not because of her." Duke's tail didn't wag. His body didn't move, but his eyes stayed locked on Andre's, pupils dilated, breath rattling quietly. Soraya placed a gentle hand on Andre's arm, but he didn't look at her. "We're losing him," she said softly. "His heart's failing. Whatever it was, it's spreading fast." "No," Andre said, shaking his head once, as if refusing to let the words settle. No, he's strong. He's been through worse. Duke let out another small sound. This one weaker, a breath that seemed to slip past his lips more than form within him. Andre knelt beside the table, his hands cradling Duke's face, thumbs stroking the familiar shape of his cheeks, the patch of silver just beneath one ear, the scar from a training incident years ago that never quite faded. Every inch of him was familiar, etched into Andre's life with the kind of permanence that didn't allow for endings. "You saved me more times than I can count," Andre murmured, blinking against the sting behind his eyes. "Every long night, every damn trial, you were there, always. Don't make me do this without you." For a moment, silence. Then, slowly, Duke blinked. His eyes, though glassy, remained on Andre's face. He let out a final breath, one that lingered on Andre's skin as if trying to say something words never could. And then, stillness. No gasp, no jolt, just absence. Quiet and absolute. The monitors flatlined with a single thin note. Soraya reached to silence it, but the sound had already scorched itself into Andre's ears. His hands stayed where they were, cupping Duke's head, eyes shut tight as if refusing to open would stop the moment from existing. He didn't know how long he stayed like that. Long enough for the room to clear, for the assistant to step out with damp eyes, for Soraya to place a hand gently on his shoulder and leave it there without saying a word. She understood. This wasn't just a pet. This wasn't just grief. It was betrayal. It was a gun fired in secret and hidden behind a smile. It was hate delivered in silence, disguised as caution. It was murder without a name. Andre finally stood, his body slow and heavy, hands trembling, as he reached down one last time to stroke the fur along Duke's back. The warmth was fading now. The weight was shifting from living presence to memory. He turned without a word, stepped out into the hallway, and walked through the fluorescent-lit corridors until the evening sun hit his skin again. The brightness didn't offer comfort. It only reminded him how wrong the day had gone, how something so small, so calculated, had been enough to end a life built on loyalty and love. In the car, he sat for a long time without turning the key. Then he reached for his phone. His voice, when he finally spoke, was low but unshakable. "Sharon, it's done. He's gone." He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. He put the car in gear. And this time, he wasn't going home to rest. He was going to war. The porch light was still on when Andre turned the corner, his footsteps steady but weighted, every step forward dragging behind it the full weight of the night. The streetlights flickered in sterile pools across driveways and hedges, casting long shadows that shifted like witnesses turning away. The air had cooled, but there was no relief in it. The taste of grief still clung to the back of his throat, bitter and raw, like iron. His hands, though cleaned of the scent of his dog's fur, still curled unconsciously, as though Duke's final breaths were imprinted in the muscle memory of his fingers. Karen Mallory stood at the top of her porch, the same white robe tied in a neat bow around her waist, the same wine glass perched loosely between her fingers, as if she had just emerged from a lifestyle magazine photo shoot designed to project grace and domestic calm. She didn't expect him. Not tonight. And certainly not like this. Andre didn't speak as he approached, didn't call out or hesitate. He walked across her driveway onto her front lawn and stopped at the bottom of the steps, like a storm cloud settling just before the sky split open. Karen looked down at him, brows furrowed, eyes narrowing in wary confusion. "You need something?" she asked, her voice cold with suspicion, the kind that wraps itself in civility, but rings hollow when tested. Andre raised his head slowly, met her gaze with the full weight of his loss, burning just beneath the surface of his expression. "He's dead." Karen blinked, and for a moment there was silence, thick, pregnant with meaning. She tilted her head slightly. "Excuse me? Duke. My dog. The one you said was dangerous. The one you said didn't belong here. The one you stood out here watching every morning like a criminal casing the neighborhood. He's dead. Her lips parted, and something flickered in her expression. Was it surprise, or just the performance of it? Her brows lifted slightly. She let out a small breath and sipped her wine. Well, that's unfortunate. I'm sorry to hear that, I guess. But what's it got to do with me? Andre stepped onto the bottom stair, closing the distance, his voice low, stripped of all pleasantries. He died after eating something left at the edge of your property. Something made to look like a treat. You think I don't notice details? I walk that street every morning, and I've never seen anything there until today. Karen's mask of neutrality began to crack at the edges, her tone hardening. Are you accusing me of something? I'm stating facts, Andre said, his gaze unflinching. The treat was planted. Duke ate it, and within minutes he was on the ground. He died at the vet an hour later. I didn't put anything out, she snapped, stepping forward, her wine sloshing slightly. You think I'm responsible for your dog dying? That's outrageous. You come onto my lawn, start making wild accusations. What do you think this is? Some kind of courtroom? No, he said calmly, eyes narrowing. Not yet. Karen's eyes flared at that. You're threatening me now? Is that what this is? You think just because something happened near my property, I'm somehow to blame? Andre didn't move, didn't blink. You made it clear how you felt about him. You made it clear how you felt about me. And now, the dog you were so desperate to get rid of is gone. Less than an hour after I saw you standing on this porch, watching me. So you tell me, what am I supposed to think? Karen's voice rose sharply, brittle and furious. That's your problem. You people are always playing the victim, always looking for someone to blame. Maybe you weren't paying attention to your own damn animal. Maybe he got into something because you weren't controlling him properly. But no, of course it's easier to point fingers. Andre tilted his head, just slightly, something shifting behind his eyes. Not anger, but resolve. You want to talk about control? Let me tell you something, Karen. You picked the wrong man for this. You thought I'd get loud, thought I'd lose my temper, give you something to cling to. You don't know who I am. Oh, I know exactly who you are, she snapped, wine forgotten now, hand on her hip. You're one of those smug types who think they can walk into any neighborhood and expect everyone else to change the rules just to make you comfortable. You've been nothing but a problem since the day you moved in. Andre let the silence settle between them for just a moment longer. Let her believe she still had the upper hand. Let her voice echo like triumph. Then he stepped up to the next stair, his posture still calm, still measured. I'm the Attorney General of this state, Karen faltered, just briefly. One foot shifting back, eyes blinking once, sharply. But then something else returned to her face, a curl of disdain around her mouth, a sneer born from decades of being told she was untouchable. So what? You think that scares me? You think waving your title around is going to make me fall at your feet? This is Meadow Glen, Mr. Whitaker. I don't care what you do in Richmond. Around here, people still expect their neighbors to act civilized. Andre smiled, but there was nothing warm in it. Only precision. Good, because I intend to handle this with complete civility. Through every legal channel, every investigative agency, every resource at my disposal. And when it's done, when every piece of this story is documented and exposed, I won't have to say a word to make sure everyone knows exactly who you are. Karen opened her mouth, but no sound came. Not because she was afraid. No, not yet. Because she still believed in the myth of her own protection, in the armor of her zip code, her skin, her history. She still thought the world would bend before her, before it broke. Andre stepped down slowly, not turning his back until he'd cleared the stairs. His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. Sleep well, Karen, while you still can. And with that, he turned into the dark, footsteps carrying with them the storm she thought would never come. Andre didn't sleep that night, not even in the shallow way a grieving man sometimes tricks his body into rest. He sat at his desk in the study long after Sharon had quietly padded down the hallway, leaving a warm hand on his shoulder and a soft look that didn't press for words. The folder on the desk, still labeled Karen M., lay open in front of him, its contents meager, but the edges now heavy with significance. The pamphlets, the notes, the timestamps he'd written down. Each morning Karen had been on that porch watching him with that sour twist in her mouth. Every moment had been recorded with the discipline of a man who didn't forget patterns. And now those pieces, once scattered and benign, had begun to form the outline of something far uglier. By morning, the first call he placed was to the vet's office. Not to question the facts, but to request the report. Dr. Soraya Hale answered herself, her voice laced with the residual heaviness of the night before. She didn't offer sympathy, not in the empty, obligatory way others might. She offered clarity, offered truth. "We ran the toxicology overnight," she said, her tone professional but gentle. There were heavy traces of anticoagulant rodenticide, highly concentrated, the kind designed to make an animal bleed from the inside. That treat was soaked in it. I've already signed the official incident report and filed it with animal control. Andre listened in silence, letting the confirmation settle. It wasn't a surprise. It was a nail, one of many he would line up before hammering them home, one by one. "I'll need a copy," he said, "for formal use. I'll send it today. I'm so sorry, Andre. He was a good dog." "I know," he said quietly, and ended the call. From there, the rhythm returned. Not the rhythm of grief, but of action. The kind of steady momentum that had built his career and leveled obstacles in courtrooms most wouldn't dare enter. He pulled up the footage from his exterior security cameras, not expecting a miracle, but hoping for a shadow, a gesture, something. The early morning reel, time-stamped just after 5 a.m., showed nothing clear. No face, no close-up, but a faint silhouette did appear near the edge of Karen's lawn, bending slightly before retreating inside. He paused it, replayed it, then saved the file. It wasn't conclusive. Not yet, but it was a thread. Next, he sent a message to Julius Raymond, a quiet, precise man who handled digital forensics for the Attorney General's office, usually on tech crimes, cyber threats, high-end fraud. Andre didn't explain everything in the message, just enough to prompt a secure call. By noon, Julius was in his driveway. The man said nothing as he entered the house, just raised an eyebrow when Andre handed him the USB with the security footage and a copy of the vet's report. In the office, with Sharon watching from the doorway, Andre finally explained, not just the poisoning, but the buildup, the tension, the pattern of harassment. Julius listened, brow furrowed, then sat at the desk with quiet efficiency and began copying files onto his encrypted laptop. "You got her Wi-Fi password?" he asked casually, not looking up. Andre shook his head. "Not yet." Julius smirked. "Give me a few hours." Sharon crossed her arms, speaking for the first time. "If we're doing this, it needs to be clean. Above board. No shortcuts. No accusations without solid ground." "It will be," Andre said. "She thinks this is about emotion, about me being angry, but it's not. It's about evidence, about the law." Julius glanced up, a flicker of admiration in his eyes, "and about making her eat her words on the stand. Every last one," Andre said. By late afternoon, the investigation had begun to take shape. Julius confirmed that several doorbell cameras on the street had cloud backups, data potentially retrievable with warrants or cooperative neighbors. Andre made a list of houses that faced the area where the treat had been placed. One of them belonged to a young couple, Luis and Kendra Vasquez, who had waved politely on occasion but mostly kept to themselves. Andre knocked on their door just after dinner. Dressed neatly, the sharp lines of his jacket more legal armor than formality. Luis opened the door, and recognition flashed in his eyes. "Mr. Whitaker," he said, "we heard about your dog. We're really sorry." Andre offered a brief nod. Thank you. I won't keep you long. I'm trying to collect footage from this morning. There was an incident outside my property. I'm hoping your doorbell cam might have caught something." Louise glanced back at Kendra, who was already pulling up the app on her phone. "Of course. We've got it all on cloud backup. I'll email you the last 24 hours. By nightfall, Andre had 2 more angles, neither giving a perfect view, but both confirming motion near Karen's lawn at the exact time he'd seen in his own footage. The figure was too far to identify, but it wasn't random. It was someone with intent. And Karen's house was the only place the figure entered. The next morning, Andre filed a formal report with Animal Control and contacted the sheriff's office, submitting his initial statement. He didn't pull rank. He didn't push. He let the process begin like it would for anyone else, because the end game was never just about punishment. It was about exposure. Karen Mallory still sat on her porch like nothing had happened. She still waved to some of the neighbors who hadn't yet heard the story, still held her wine glass like a performance prop, still smiled in that tight, self-satisfied way that suggested she believed the worst was over. She had no idea it had only just begun. It was 2 days after the report had been filed, the grief still fresh in the house, but beginning to evolve into something quieter, colder, purpose forged in the heat of loss. The morning was calm, deceptively so. The sky stretched wide in that pale blue hue that never quite matched its peace. Andre stood in the front room, the blinds cracked just enough to see the street. He wasn't hiding. He wasn't waiting. He was watching. Because that's what war looked like in places like Meadow Glen. No shouting, no overt attacks, just measured steps on manicured sidewalks and smiles that didn't reach the eyes. So when Karen Mallory appeared walking a dog of her own, some wiry white terrier that yipped at its leash like it had something to prove, it wasn't a surprise. It was a move. Calculated. Performed. She strolled past his property with an exaggerated swing in her gait, her hair styled, her outfit deliberate. Bright colors, spring tones, all pastel innocence. She didn't look toward the house, not immediately. She pretended she didn't see the black SUV parked beside the driveway, didn't notice the blinds shift slightly as she passed, didn't hear the faint click of the lock as Andre stepped outside and let the storm door close quietly behind him. The moment her gaze flicked toward him, her expression shifted, not to concern, not even guilt, but something closer to smug satisfaction, barely restrained behind a mask of civility. "Morning," she called, stopping at the edge of his property. Her little dog barked, jerking at its leash, and she smiled down at it like the sound was musical. "Figured I'd get back to my routine. It's such a lovely day." Andre said nothing for a long moment. He stood at the top of the steps, his hands tucked in his pockets, shoulders relaxed, though his eyes never left hers. "Don't think I've ever seen you walk a dog before." Karen's smile didn't falter. "Oh, I've always had her. I just didn't want to walk her while, that other one was around." There was no need to elaborate. They both knew exactly who that other one was. Andre's jaw clenched slightly, but he didn't rise to it. "You must be feeling bold," he said quietly, eyes drifting to the leash wrapped loosely around her wrist, parading around like nothing happened. "Like this isn't the eye of the storm." Karen shrugged, feigning ignorance. "Storm? I think you're being a bit dramatic. Your accusations didn't exactly hold up the way you wanted, did they? From what I hear, you still don't have proof. Just assumptions." Andre took a step down, slow and deliberate, letting each word settle before speaking. "Assumptions are for people who don't know how to build cases. I know how to pull threads until everything comes apart. You think this ends with Duke? You think I only filed one report?" She blinked, then tilted her head, a brittle little laugh escaping her lips. "You really don't know when to let things go, do you?" "Oh, I do," Andre replied, stepping closer now, his voice still low, still composed, but heavy with a certainty she couldn't laugh off. But not when the pattern is this clear. Not when someone spent years getting away with the kind of cruelty that hides behind HOA meetings and anonymous complaints. Karen's mouth opened, but he didn't let her speak. See? I started digging, not just into that morning, but into you. Your name's been on a half-dozen incident reports from the last 5 years. Noise complaints against the Rodriguez family that moved in across from you before they sold their home under value and left town. Complaints filed against the Jamesons when their black nephew visited and parked his truck on the curb. Letters to the HOA about standards of decorum and suspicious individuals. You never use slurs. Never say anything you can't defend in a statement. But the pattern's there, and it's loud. Karen's smile faded slightly, her mouth thinning into a line. And now, Andre continued, with Duke dead, a toxicology report in my hand, and camera footage that places movement outside your lawn at the exact time of day you were out there. Well, let's just say the sheriff's office is very interested in the full picture, especially when the Attorney General of the state is the one asking for transparency. Her eyes narrowed. You're trying to threaten me with your office? No, he said, stepping off the final stair, voice dropping to something colder. I'm not threatening you. I'm reminding you that your little performance, the robe, the wine glass, the innocent routine, none of it's going to hold up once the subpoenas start rolling in. You have no idea how deep I can go. This isn't about revenge. This is about accountability. And I'm going to ensure that every lie, every whisper campaign, every passive-aggressive note you've ever hidden behind is pulled into the light. Karen's dog barked again, tugging on the leash. She didn't speak for a moment, her face pale now, lips pressed together in a tight, defensive line. I've lived here for 20 years, she said finally, her voice low. I know this neighborhood. I know these people. They won't turn on me. Andre looked her over once, then turned his back and began walking slowly toward the house, calling over his shoulder with a calm finality that left no room for argument. They won't have a choice. He didn't wait for a response. The conversation was over. Not because he had silenced her, but because she didn't yet understand that this wasn't about who the neighborhood believed. It was about what the law revealed. And when the documents came forward, when the complaints and footage and forensic reports aligned like threads in a net, there would be no safe place left for her to stand. Not here, not anywhere. Back inside, Andre returned to the desk. Julius had just messaged. One of the neighbors down the block had agreed to release their security footage, and a data retrieval warrant had been filed for Karen's digital activity. Emails, deleted texts, anything suspicious flagged by behavioral patterns. It was no longer about what had been done. It was about everything that came before, and everything she thought she got away with. The breakthrough came 3 days later, not with fanfare or some dramatic flourish, but in the form of a quiet notification blinking at the corner of Andre's screen. Just a small, unassuming email from Julius Raymond, flagged as encrypted and urgent. Andre had been at his desk all morning, sorting through statements from neighbors, compiling photos of the sidewalk where Duke had collapsed, organizing a timeline so airtight it could suffocate a lie. When the alert chimed, he paused mid-sentence, eyes narrowing as he clicked it open. What waited on the other side wasn't just confirmation. It was fire. Subject: Karen Mallory. Search history. Archive: pulled from router logs. 14-day snapshot. Attached was a secure file. Rows of digital fingerprints. Every click, every curiosity, every breadcrumb she had left behind in the quiet confidence of assumed privacy. Julius had traced her activity through the home's router after obtaining a preliminary authorization, working around firewalls she hadn't even realized were there. The data had been stripped of timestamps, organized, and now laid bare on Andre's screen like a confession too stubborn to admit itself aloud. He scrolled slowly, reading each line not with surprise but with the kind of grim vindication that only deepens when truth confirms every suspicion. Is rat poison fatal to dogs? How to make dog treats at home, no bake. How long does it take for dog to die from poison? What's the penalty for poisoning an animal in Virginia? How to keep neighbor's dog off your lawn? Are security cameras admissible in court? What does the Attorney General actually do? Andre leaned back in his chair, the last query lingering longer than the rest. That one, tucked quietly between two Google searches about homemade peanut butter recipes and HOA guidelines, wasn't just incriminating. It was insulting. Karen had known. Maybe not right away, not when she placed the bait, but at some point after that, after the confrontation, after his calm refusal to be baited into rage, it had dawned on her. She had looked him up. She had typed his name into that little search bar, hoping to understand what she was up against. And still, she had walked past his house with that damn terrier, parading her confidence like a badge, as though audacity could shield her from consequence. Now, there would be no more hiding. He forwarded the file to the sheriff's office with a brief statement, marked urgent. Then he called Sharon into the office, watching her eyes scan the list, her mouth tightening with each line. "She's not just a bigot," she said quietly. "She's calculating. She planned it. She thought it would be small," Andre replied, standing and walking toward the window. Something beneath the surface, easy to explain away. An accident, a misunderstanding. Something a white woman with the right tone could dismiss with enough tears and the right lawyer. Sharon stepped closer, her voice cool and measured. And now she's one search term away from criminal intent. There was no joy in it, no satisfaction, only clarity. Andre wasn't celebrating. There was no victory in uncovering the rot that had always been there, just a colder resolve to excise it fully. This wasn't about Duke anymore. It wasn't even about Karen. It was about every person she'd quietly harmed and walked away from without consequence. That afternoon, Andre returned to the sheriff's office to present the compiled timeline. Footage from 3 different angles: the vet's signed toxicology report, the search history file, and a binder thick with documented behavioral complaints from former neighbors. The lead investigator, a seasoned black woman named Detective Alicia Rourke, studied the evidence in silence before leaning back and closing the file with slow deliberation. "She's toast," Rourke said, tapping the folder with 2 fingers. "We've seen this kind of case before, but never this thorough. She thought she was safe behind plausible deniability, but this shows intent." "I want full transparency," Andre said. "No hush deals, no quiet apologies. I want a formal charge, a real court date." Rourke nodded once. "You'll have it." Word spread fast after the formal charge was filed. Karen received the notice the next morning, served directly to her door. She opened it while standing on her porch, robe askew, hair frayed at the edges from nights spent sleepless. Andre watched from his study window as the envelope trembled in her hand. She didn't shout, didn't cry. She just froze, staring at the papers as if willing them to vanish, willing the words to rearrange themselves into something less damning. But they didn't. Later that evening, Officer Jenna Paulson stopped by Andre's home. She had been the first to respond on the day Duke collapsed, and though protocol had kept her distant at first, something had shifted when she learned who Andre was. Now, standing in his entryway, uniform crisp, she held her hat in her hand like the moment demanded something more than formality. "I heard the DA's office is moving ahead," she said. "Good, they are," Andre said, nodding. "But it's not just about her anymore. It's about what she represents. How long she's been allowed to act like this?" Paulson nodded, jaw tight. "I've had her flagged in the system for years. Complaints filed by renters, by kids on skateboards, families that didn't look right to her. Nothing ever stuck. But this will." Andre stepped back and let her inside. The conversation moved from facts to stories. Paulson quietly sharing how often women like Karen used law enforcement as a shield, how racial bias dressed itself in neighborhood concern. She didn't say the word racism outright. She didn't need to. It hung in the space between them. Understood. By the time the sun dipped behind the rooftops, Andre stood on his porch again, alone, his arms crossed, as the evening breeze swept softly through the hedges. Karen's house across the street was dark, the curtains drawn, the porch light off for the first time in weeks. He didn't need to see her to know what she was doing, panicking, Googling new questions, calling old friends who no longer answered, and somewhere in the quiet of her kitchen, maybe staring at the same wine glass that once trembled in her hand, she would finally begin to understand. It wasn't just about Duke. It was about justice. And it was coming. The knock came just after 9. A hard, sharp pounding that rattled the frosted glass inset on the front door. Not once, but in 3 rapid, forceful bursts. Sharon had just left the den, tea in hand, pausing mid-step with a glance toward Andre, who hadn't moved from the armchair. He looked up slowly, gaze shifting toward the door, not with surprise, but recognition. He didn't need to ask who it was. The rhythm was too frantic, too entitled, too loud for anything else. "I'll handle it," he said quietly, standing with a calm that didn't match the noise outside. By the time he reached the entryway, the pounding came again, louder this time, knuckles slamming against wood with the kind of rage that didn't mask desperation so much as announce it. Andre unlocked the door and opened it halfway, his face composed, his body blocking the threshold. The porch light illuminated Karen Mallory in full unraveling, hair disheveled, robe hanging open over day clothes she hadn't bothered to button properly, cheeks flushed, eyes wild with something that hovered between rage and panic. "You smug bastard!" she hissed, the words spilling out before he could even speak. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Andre didn't respond right away. He studied her, the way her hands clenched at her sides, how the folded court summons was crumpled in one fist, wrinkled and damp at the corners, as if she'd been gripping it for hours. Her dog was nowhere in sight. Her mask of composure was gone. "You're going to regret this," she said, stepping forward until she was inches from the doorway, jabbing a finger toward his chest. "You think this is justice? This is harassment. You've poisoned my name with lies, turned the entire neighborhood against me. I've got people whispering when I walk past now. Friends aren't returning calls. My HOA position's under review, all because of you." "No," Andre said calmly, hands still at his sides. "All because of you." Her face twisted, nostrils flaring. "You had no right digging into my life. That search history was private. You invaded my home. I followed the law," he said. "You should try it sometime." That pushed her over the edge. She surged forward without warning, her palms striking him hard across the face. An open-handed slap meant less to injure and more to humiliate, to shatter his composure, to provoke the reaction she had been waiting for since the beginning. The sound cracked in the night air like a snapped branch. Sharon gasped from behind him, her mug crashing somewhere near the hallway. Karen stood there panting, hand still raised, chest heaving, as if the force of her own blow had startled her more than him. Andre didn't touch his face. He didn't flinch. He stood still, the red mark blooming slowly on his cheek, as silence stretched long between them. The porch light buzzed faintly above, casting a yellow halo that seemed to isolate them from the world, just the two of them, and the consequences between them. "You're finished," Karen whispered, her voice trembling now, losing volume even as her posture tried to stay defiant. "You've ruined everything. And for what? Some dog?" "For justice," Andre said, reaching into his pocket. She didn't see the phone until it was already unlocked in his hand, the screen aglow. He didn't shout, didn't threaten. He simply pressed a single number, the one already queued. 911. "What's your emergency?" the voice answered. "I'm reporting an assault," Andre said, still looking directly at Karen. "An adult white female, early 50s, assaulted me on my own property. She forced her way up to my front door, struck me across the face. I have a witness and security footage." Karen's expression shifted mid-sentence, disbelief giving way to something closer to terror. She stepped back once, then again, hands trembling now, as if the gravity of what she'd done had only just begun to take shape in her mind. "You're calling the cops on me?" she said, the arrogance faltering beneath her words. "Yes," Andre said, his voice steady. "And they're going to take your statement this time. You don't get to hide behind phone calls and pamphlets and performance outrage anymore. You've made this personal. Now it's legal." The dispatcher confirmed the unit was on its way. Andre hung up, still watching her, but this time there was no warning in his voice. No restraint, just inevitability. "You assaulted a public official on record," he said. "There's no spin for this. No HOA complaint to file. You'll have your day in court." She turned, almost stumbling down the steps, her breath coming in sharp bursts, as if she had been running without moving. For the first time, she didn't look back. Minutes later, 2 squad cars pulled into the drive, blue and red lights flashing low against the houses that stood quiet and curious in the distance. Officer Paulson stepped out of the first vehicle, her expression unreadable until she saw the mark on Andre's face, and nodded once in quiet confirmation. The other officer approached Karen, where she stood frozen on the curb, arms crossed, face pale. Andre stayed back, letting the officers do their work. He gave his statement cleanly, directly, knowing the footage from the porch camera had already captured everything. Sharon stood beside him now, silent, watching the scene unfold, as if still waiting to wake up. "She really thought she was untouchable," she said softly, her voice carrying not surprise, but a kind of exhausted disbelief. "She's spent her life being told she was," Andre replied, "but this time, the world is watching." Across the street, Karen was being placed into the back of the cruiser. Not cuffed, not yet, but no longer in control. Her posture had collapsed inward, no longer a towering sentinel of neighborhood righteousness, but a woman unraveling, thread by thread, under the weight of her own design. As the cruisers rolled away and the flashing lights receded into the night, Andre exhaled slowly, the air cold in his lungs, but cleaner somehow. The battle was no longer his alone. Now, the system would answer. The next few days moved like a slow wave, steady and unstoppable, each moment rising higher with the quiet hum of process and consequence. Karen Mallory was no longer a name spoken in passing on front lawns or over hedges with benign curiosity. She had become a headline, a warning, a symbol. The arrest had not gone unnoticed. The squad cars parked outside her home that night had painted her guilt in red and blue, and while no formal statement had been released to the press, whispers had already taken shape and grown teeth. Meadow Glen, a neighborhood built on its image of perfection, was now nursing a bruise it couldn't cover with landscaping and silence. Andre stood in the foyer that Thursday morning, phone pressed lightly to his ear, as the Commonwealth's attorney reviewed the formal charges aloud. His tone was measured, almost clinical, but Andre didn't need dramatics to understand the magnitude. 1 count of aggravated animal cruelty with intent, based on the toxicology report and search history. 1 count of trespassing. 1 count of assault on a public official. 2 counts of harassment, based on your logs and testimony from other residents. And a formal ethics violation filed with the HOA, which, frankly, is the least of her worries. Andre gave a quiet nod, knowing the words weren't meant to soothe, but to confirm that the legal engine had begun turning in earnest. "She still hasn't retained counsel," the attorney added. "That tells me she doesn't understand the storm she's in." "She will," Andre said, ending the call with a quiet click. Across the street, Karen's once pristine house had begun to resemble a barricade more than a home. Curtains were drawn at all hours, porch furniture removed, the porch light left off like some silent plea to avoid further attention. But attention now was not something she could turn off with a switch. The sheriff's office had confirmed that search warrants were being executed. Emails, text messages, HOA correspondence, All of it was under review. What emerged from those records was worse than Andre expected. Julius called that afternoon, his voice low but laced with something that hovered between disbelief and fury. "She wasn't just a bigot," he said. "She was a campaigner." "What do you mean?" "There are emails, dozens, to other HOA members. She forwarded blog links about property value risks, mostly targeting minority families. She created burner accounts to report people for violations, then pretended to be anonymous complainants. And the kicker, she sent an email 2 weeks ago to the HOA board suggesting they start a petition to require background checks for new buyers." Andre's jaw tightened, the weight of it settling into place. It was bigger than cruelty, bigger than one poisoned dog and one angry woman. Karen had been working quietly, systematically, using the language of decorum and the shield of bureaucracy to build a gate around her neighborhood. And she had been weaponizing her influence in ways that went far deeper than a single act of violence. "Send everything to the Commonwealth's attorney," Andre said. "They'll decide how far to take it." Later that evening, he received a message from Luis Vasquez, the neighbor who had offered his doorbell footage. Andre had kept in touch, thanking him, keeping him informed as more pieces of the case took shape. But this message was different. Less about support, more about something new. "Just wanted you to know. We got a letter. Anonymous. No name, no return address. Slipped into our mailbox. Said we should keep our doors locked now that we're siding with outsiders." Andre read the message twice, then stood silently in the darkened study, the phone still in his hand. Sharon stepped in from the hallway, eyes catching the tension in his stance. "More fallout?" He nodded. "Someone's trying to scare them." "Push back." Sharon crossed the room, touching his arm gently. "Then it's working, which means it's close." And she was right. The next morning, the news broke in earnest. Local woman charged with multiple counts in dog poisoning case. The story ran with photos of Karen, both her formal HOA headshot and the blurred frame of her on the porch during her confrontation with Andre. The piece detailed the evidence, the treat laced with poison, the vet's report, the aggressive emails, the attempted intimidation. Duke's name was mentioned prominently. A photo of him sitting proudly beside Andre in his backyard accompanied the article. And for the first time since this began, Andre felt something in his chest shift. It wasn't closure, not yet, but it was something close to justice moving forward on its own legs. Public reaction came swiftly. An online petition circulated calling for Karen's permanent removal from the HOA and her disqualification from serving in any community leadership role. Neighbors who had remained silent began to reach out, quietly, cautiously, some with apologies, others with confessions of past moments they'd ignored, things they'd dismissed because they had seemed too small to matter at the time. And through it all, Andre remained steady. Not because it was easy, but because it was necessary. He sat on the porch that evening with Sharon, the air crisp around them, the silence of the street no longer laced with judgment, but uncertainty. She poured 2 glasses of wine and handed one to him, her gaze tracing the outline of the house across the street. "She's going to be convicted," Sharon said, softly but certainly. "She's already lost," Andre replied, but even as he said it, he knew the next step would matter more than any before. Because this wasn't just about guilt. It was about the cost. And in the courtroom, in front of the judge, in front of the press and the state, and every person who thought a polite tone could excuse hatred, he was going to make sure the cost was paid in full. The courthouse rose ahead like a fortress of ritual, its old stone steps worn by the weight of generations seeking justice, its high-arched doors polished not by care, but by use. It was a place where truths were stripped bare, sometimes slowly, sometimes all at once. And as Andre stepped through the metal detectors, briefcase in hand, suit pressed with quiet precision, he carried with him the full gravity of what the day represented. He wasn't here as Attorney General, Not officially. He wasn't prosecuting, wasn't presenting, but his presence was far from passive. He had come not just to witness, but to ensure the truth he had built was heard in full voice, stripped of spin and shadow. Karen was already inside. He saw her the moment he entered the courtroom, a figure hunched slightly at the defense table, her once meticulously styled hair now limp and dull, her complexion pale beneath the harsh white light that had no use for flattery. She didn't look at him. Not once. Her eyes remained fixed on the desk in front of her. A woman desperately willing herself invisible in a room built to expose. Her attorney, a thin man with thinning hair and the jittery energy of someone already aware he was outmatched, sat beside her, flipping through a legal pad like it could rescue them both. The Commonwealth's team moved with quiet confidence. They didn't need to posture. The evidence, once scattered like glass on the pavement, had been swept up and arranged with care. Footage, search records, witness statements, expert testimony from the vet and digital analysts. There would be no theatrics today, just consequences. The judge, a seasoned woman with a voice like gravel and the patience of stone, entered, and the room settled into silence. Proceedings began. Names were read, charges outlined, and though Karen's attorney entered a plea of not guilty on her behalf, the words rang hollow in the space, met not with surprise, but with stillness. The prosecution began its opening statement, measured and direct, laying out the facts not with venom, but precision. Andre sat 2 rows behind the counsel tables, eyes focused not on the attorneys, but on Karen. It wasn't vindictive. It wasn't even personal. Not anymore. It was necessary, because justice required not just proof, but presence. The community needed to see that the line had been crossed, and that someone was willing to stand on the other side of it. Midway through the testimony, Dr. Soraya Hale was called to the stand. She spoke with the same clarity she'd shown in the clinic, her words grounded in science, her tone devoid of judgment. She described Duke's symptoms, the rapid collapse, the toxicology results, rat poison in high concentration. Her final line, delivered with quiet weight, landed hard in the stillness. By the time Mr. Whitaker carried him through our doors, Duke was already dying. Nothing we could have done would have reversed it. The poison had been in his system too long. Karen flinched. The next witness was Julius Raymond, who walked the court through the search history, the network logs, and the sequence of queries that painted a timeline of intent. He didn't embellish. He didn't need to. The words, "How long does it take for a dog to die from poison?" said enough all on their own. And still, Karen did not look up. But it wasn't until the final witness that the silence in the room began to shift. Luis Vasquez took the stand with quiet nerves but firm voice, describing the anonymous letter his family received after sharing the camera footage. "It said we should lock our doors," he told the court, his hand resting over Kendra's in the gallery. "That we'd chosen the wrong side. That's not something you forget." The judge allowed the letter to be submitted as supporting evidence, and when Karen's attorney objected, the judge overruled without hesitation. The pattern of behavior was clear. This wasn't about one act. This was about escalation. As court adjourned for the day, Andre remained seated for a moment longer, even as the room began to empty. Karen rose slowly, still refusing to meet his gaze. But then, perhaps out of instinct, or the realization that the walls were closing in, she glanced back. And in that instant, their eyes met. Not across a street, not through a windshield or a security feed, but here, where lies had nowhere left to hide. Andre didn't gloat. He didn't nod. He simply held her gaze, calm and steady, until she looked away first. Outside the courthouse, reporters waited, cameras flashing, microphones angled like weapons. Sharon joined him on the steps, her hand resting lightly at his back. "Are you going to say something?" she asked quietly. Andre looked at the crowd, then at the courthouse behind him, and finally at the blue sky overhead. "No," he said. "Not yet. The law's already speaking." He stepped down into the crowd, calm amidst the flashing lights, letting the moment pass without claiming it. The real victory wasn't the headline, it was the truth, laid bare for all to see, impossible now to ignore. And inside, in a courtroom no longer hers to manipulate, Karen Mallory sat alone with the echo of her own choices. The second day of the trial opened under heavy skies, the kind that threatened rain without the commitment to follow through, gray clouds casting long shadows over the courthouse steps. The kind of weather that left people on edge, waiting. Inside the courtroom, the air held that same tension, not in words or movement, but in the way people sat a little stiffer, breathed a little shallower, knowing they were inching toward a final reckoning. What had begun as neighborhood gossip had matured into legal consequence, and the eyes of the state, once distant and impersonal, now stared directly into the heart of Meadow Glen. Karen Mallory looked like a ghost of the woman who had once stood on her porch, as if the concrete beneath her feet had been consecrated. The bright blouses had been replaced with a muted gray jacket that seemed to swallow her whole. The bright blouses had been replaced with a muted gray jacket that seemed to swallow her whole. Her face, once tightly arranged with superiority, now sagged at the corners, drained of color and certainty. Even the arrogant posture she had carried into court on day one had wilted beneath the mounting testimony. Her shoulders pulled in as if she could shrink out of sight. But there was no corner of the courtroom to vanish into. Not anymore. The prosecution began the day by introducing a string of character witnesses, not for Karen, for the people she had quietly worked to silence. The Rodriguez family, long since moved from Meadow Glen, had agreed to appear remotely. Their testimony came via video, but the impact struck clean and deep. Mrs. Rodriguez described the series of anonymous complaints filed against their property. Grass height violations, children playing too loudly, unfamiliar vehicles parked out front for short visits. Each complaint arrived without a name, but the language, they said, had always felt specific. Too personal, too familiar, a pattern that matched exactly what the court had already heard. Next came Officer Jenna Paulson, called to the stand to speak not just about Karen's behavior during the incident, but her pattern of calls to the department. Always vague, always couched in language like suspicious behavior, and I felt unsafe. Paulson pulled up dispatch records showing Karen had called the non-emergency line 23 times over the past 3 years, each report targeting a person of color. She knew exactly how to use language that doesn't sound racist, but always targets race, Paulson said, her voice even, her gaze steady. It's weaponized civility, and it works until someone shines a light on it. Karen's attorney objected, calling it speculative. The judge overruled without pause. Andre sat motionless through it all, his presence still deliberate, still quiet. He hadn't been called to testify himself. The prosecution had already submitted his statement into the record, along with the evidence he had compiled, organized, and surrendered without embellishment. But his presence in the courtroom was testimony enough. Every glance from the jury to him reinforced the gravity of the case, not because of who he was, but because of what he'd chosen not to do. He had not shouted. He had not retaliated. He had pursued truth through process, and that made every point of evidence land with greater weight. The final witness of the day was Kendra Vasquez. She took the stand with her shoulders squared, her voice trembling only once as she recounted the day the anonymous threat arrived in their mailbox. When asked why she decided to speak, she paused for a long moment, then turned her eyes toward Karen. "Because I know what fear looks like when it comes in polite packaging," she said, "and I'm tired of pretending it's harmless." There was no outburst, no gasps, just stillness, a kind of collective breath held in the gallery as her words lingered, sharp and clean. As court recessed for the day, the press outside the courthouse swelled. They wanted statements, reactions, but Andre walked past them with the same measured calm, flanked by Sharon, who said nothing but kept her hand at the small of his back like a grounding wire. The prosecution had done what they came to do. The defense, battered and thinning, had little left to stand on. Their only play now was sympathy. Which is why, on the third day, Karen herself took the stand. Her attorney had likely advised against it. Too risky, too much room for self-destruction, but pride has a way of overriding caution when humiliation draws near. She sat on the witness chair like a woman giving an acceptance speech for a role no one wanted her to play, hands folded tightly in her lap, voice trembling with a practiced pitch. "I never meant for anyone to get hurt," she began. "I was just scared. That dog, it looked dangerous. And I didn't know who Mr. Whitaker was, or what he might be capable of. I just wanted to protect the neighborhood." It was the kind of testimony designed to win sympathy. Fragility cloaked as concern, fear stretched into justification. But as she spoke, the jury watched her with narrowed eyes, the way one listens to a story they've already stopped believing. The prosecution offered no dramatic interruption. They simply let her speak. And when cross-examination came, it was surgical. So when you searched, "How long does it take for a dog to die from poison?" that was for your safety. When you made a peanut butter treat, laced it with rodenticide, and left it at the edge of your lawn, that was self-defense. And when you struck the Attorney General of this state across the face in front of a witness, that was protection. Karen's answers grew thin, evasive, wrapped in qualifiers and hypotheticals. The courtroom watched her unravel, not with violence, but with quiet erosion, each answer cracking the mask until there was nothing left but the bare, undeniable shape of her choices. When she finally stepped down, she didn't meet anyone's eyes, not the jury's, not the judge's, not Andre's. The prosecution rested that afternoon, and the judge, after a long pause, addressed the jury with the gravity of what was to come. "We will reconvene tomorrow for closing statements. After that, you will deliberate. This matter, however personal it may feel, is about facts. And facts, as we've seen, have a way of speaking for themselves." As the court emptied for the evening, Andre remained seated for a while longer, staring at the empty witness chair. The tension had stretched to its limit now. Every question asked, every line drawn. The story was no longer his to tell. Tomorrow, it would belong to the verdict. The morning light filtered over the courthouse in pale, narrow beams. The sky stretched in streaks of silver that never quite turned to blue. The air was still, the quiet tense with expectation. And as Andre climbed the courthouse steps in that calm, deliberate gait that had become his armor, he felt the weight of something final moving through him. Not an ending exactly. Grief never bowed to such ceremony, but a turning, the slow pivot from tragedy to consequence. Inside, the courtroom sat hushed, not with silence born of politeness, but with the collective breath of people waiting for something that could no longer be undone. Karen Mallory sat at the defense table like a cracked statue, her posture fraying beneath the weight of each passing minute. Her suit, charcoal gray and 2 sizes too stiff, did nothing to shield her from the eyes that watched her now without sympathy. She no longer carried herself with that porch-bound righteousness or the sharp-shouldered superiority of the HOA queen who once ruled Meadow Glen with polite menace. She was a woman laid bare, her excuses drained, her story unraveled thread by thread in front of the very system she never believed could touch her. The jury entered at precisely 10:06 a.m. 12 faces, solemn and unreadable, took their seats, the verdict already folded and sealed in the foreperson's hands. A woman in her 60s, composed but clear-eyed, stood when the judge asked the question everyone had been waiting to hear. "Has the jury reached a unanimous verdict?" "We have, Your Honor." The bailiff retrieved the verdict slip and passed it to the judge, who opened it with slow, practiced care. The sound of the paper cracking echoed faintly in the chamber. Karen sat forward, lips slightly parted, a faint tremor in her fingers where they clutched the edge of the defense table. On the charge of aggravated animal cruelty with intent, the judge read, voice ringing steady, "We find the defendant, Karen Mallory, guilty." A hush swept the room. Karen inhaled sharply, the sound closer to a gasp than a breath, her composure slipping for the first time since the trial began. "On the charge of criminal trespassing, guilty. On the charge of assault on a public official, guilty. On 2 counts of targeted harassment, guilty." No one moved. Andre didn't blink. Karen's shoulders sagged, her hands falling from the table like the strings holding her upright had finally been cut. Her attorney lowered his head, as if even he had run out of strategies worth pretending to believe in. The judge called a brief recess before sentencing, but the verdict had already struck its chord. Justice had stepped into the room without shouting, and its presence left the walls trembling. Outside, reporters surged toward the courthouse steps, pressing microphones into open air, cameras flashing with the speed of rainfall. But Andre said nothing. Not yet. He waited until the press quieted, until the noise settled just enough for his voice to land cleanly. "This wasn't about vengeance," he said, his voice composed but firm. "This was about a life taken through cruelty disguised as caution, about a system that often turns its face away from harm when that harm wears a smile and speaks softly." He paused, letting the silence carry the weight of the moment before finishing. "Justice doesn't roar, it reveals." That afternoon, the courtroom filled again for sentencing. Karen entered, escorted by deputies now, no longer just an accused neighbor but a convicted criminal, her steps unsure, her gaze hollow. She didn't look toward Andre, didn't look toward anyone. The mask had fully crumbled, leaving only the woman underneath, small, bitter, and caught beneath the weight of her own design. The judge, expression unreadable, began the sentencing with the clarity of someone who had long since tired of excuses. "For the charge of aggravated animal cruelty with intent," she began, "this court sentences the defendant to 4 years in state prison, with eligibility for parole after 2. For criminal trespassing, 6 months incarceration, to be served consecutively. For the assault on a public official, 18 months incarceration, to be served consecutively. For harassment, 12 months probation, with mandatory participation in a restorative justice program and racial bias education." Karen's mouth trembled, but she didn't speak. The judge continued, her tone colder now. "Furthermore, you are hereby barred for life from serving on any neighborhood, civic, or homeowners association board in the state of Virginia. You are also prohibited from owning or fostering any animal for a period of 10 years following your release." No one applauded. No one cheered. It wasn't that kind of victory, but the silence, when it settled, was clean. As Karen was led from the courtroom in cuffs, no longer escorted, but officially taken into custody, Andre finally exhaled, not in relief, but in release. The war she had started with a whisper, with a poisoned treat buried in the grass, had ended not in rage or spectacle, but in truth, undeniable, documented, and now engraved into the public record. Outside, the sky began to break, clouds parting slowly to reveal a pale line of sun creeping through. Timid but persistent, Sharon stepped beside him, her hand finding his as they walked down the steps together. She said nothing, just matched his stride, her presence steady and grounding. "You did it," she said at last, her voice quiet. "No," Andre replied, "we did. Everyone who spoke. Everyone who refused to look away." He looked back once at the courthouse doors as they closed behind Karen Mallory. Not with hatred, not with triumph, with certainty. She had spent a lifetime learning how to hurt without consequence. Now she would spend years learning what it meant to finally answer for it. The cemetery lay just beyond the city's edge, nestled beneath a canopy of tall, rustling pines that whispered even when the air was still. It was the kind of place built for memory, not spectacle. Quiet, shaded, respectfully distant from the rest of the world. The late afternoon sun filtered down through the trees in dappled patterns, soft and golden, casting long shadows that moved gently across the trimmed grass and simple stones. There were no towering monuments here, no marble angels or elaborate inscriptions, just names, dates, and the space in between where love had once lived. Andre stepped out of the car first, the door clicking softly behind him as he paused beside the path, eyes already drifting to the road just ahead. Sharon walked with him, arm gently looped through his, her pace slow, her expression composed, but her grip tight around his wrist as if to anchor them both in the moment. Neither of them spoke. The silence between them wasn't heavy. It was sacred, carved out not by the absence of words, but by the presence of understanding. They reached the spot near the edge of the property, where the earth still bore the faint signs of a recent burial. The grass hadn't fully grown in yet, and a modest marker, matte black, polished just enough to catch the light, rested at the head of the plot. The engraving was simple. Duke, loyal until the end, 2016 to 2025. Andre crouched down slowly, his hand brushing across the top of the stone. The metal was cool beneath his fingertips, the lettering smooth, each carved word still so new it felt unfinished. He let his hand rest there for a long while, his breath deep and steady, his body still, as though he were afraid to shift too quickly and break something fragile in the air. "I should have seen it coming," he said quietly. Not to Sharon, not to the trees, but to Duke, to the stillness that now held the weight of his absence. "I knew what she was. I knew what she was capable of, and I still let us walk past that house." "You didn't let anything happen," Sharon replied gently, kneeling beside him, her voice a balm against the sharp edge of guilt. "She made that choice. You protected Duke every day of his life. You gave him more safety, more love, more dignity than most people ever get." Andre nodded, jaw tight. His eyes remained fixed on the stone. "He trusted me. Every command, every step, every look, he was always looking back to me, even when he was dying. Especially then." Sharon reached over and placed a small bouquet at the base of the stone. White lilies mixed with dark blue asters, chosen not for symbolism, but for memory. They had once filled the vases in the living room where Duke used to nap near the hearth, his head resting just beneath the windowsill, ears twitching at the hum of the neighborhood outside. "I remember the day you brought him home," she said, a faint smile touching her lips. "He was terrified of the stairs. You spent an hour on your knees, coaxing him up one at a time, like each one was a mountain." Andre chuckled softly, the sound low and warm, but heavy. He thought the coffee grinder was some kind of demon. Every time it buzzed, he'd look at me like, "You're just going to let that happen?" They sat in silence for a while, letting the breeze carry the memory between them. Birds flitted through the trees overhead, their songs light and fleeting, a gentle reminder that the world still moved, still sang, even when hearts broke quietly beneath the surface. "I hated how it ended," Andre said at last, his voice rougher now. "That it had to be about courtrooms and charges and headlines. That I couldn't just mourn him without turning it into a fight." "You didn't turn it into a fight," Sharon said firmly. "You turned it into justice, and he'd have wanted that. He knew who you were. That's why he never left your side." Andre swallowed hard, eyes still locked on the stone. "There's a piece of me that still expects to hear him pacing the hallway at night. That pause before he curled up at the door. That little grunt he always made when he settled down." Sharon's hand slipped into his. "That piece won't go away. It'll just stop hurting as sharply." They stayed there until the light began to fade, the shadows growing longer, the air cooler. Andre stood first, brushing the soil gently from his knees. He looked down one last time and placed a hand flat over the marker, his voice barely more than breath. "You did everything right," he whispered. "Everything." As they walked back toward the car, Sharon leaned into him, her head resting briefly against his shoulder. The sky had begun to shift now, streaked with the first hints of lavender and gold. It was the kind of light Duke would have loved to run in, chasing leaves or shadows, never straying far, always circling back. Andre paused before getting in, turning once more to take in the sight of the grave beneath the trees. No cameras, no crowd, no trial, just a quiet piece of land where truth had taken root. Not just for Duke, but for every silence that had ever been broken by a voice willing to stand. I hope you enjoyed that story. Please share it with your friends and subscribe so that you do not miss out on the next one. In the meantime, I have handpicked 2 stories for you that I think you will enjoy. Have a great day.